What changes is the context, what remains constant is the essence. We live in a world that prides itself on progress, where new things are labeled as better, where speed is synonymous with efficiency, and where every mistake of the past seems to be a lesson for someone else. But if so, why do the same old mistakes keep repeating themselves? Why are lessons that should surely be learned so quickly forgotten? Why is it that in the midst of so much change, things like greed, fear, and impatience seem so steadfast that they seem impervious to erosion? See as neither a conservative manifesto nor an indictment of innovation. It is a contemplative experiment, an attempt to ask who, while everyone is looking ahead, is daring to look at what remains unchanged. This book does not attempt to keep up with the times. It questions the times not to resist but to understand what is solid under the waves of change and if we understand the things that never change. Do we hold in our hands the real map to navigate the chaos? You don't have to believe everything written here. But if you've ever paused in the midst of dizzying turns and wondered if you're misunderstanding what progress is, perhaps this book is a worthwhile start not to go further, but to go deeper. Before going into this summary, we encourage listeners to buy and read the book to fully appreciate its content. Now let me start summarizing this book. There are rules in this world that are not written in books, not taught in schools, and not ranked among the necessary skills of the times. But if you ignore them, you will keep making the same mistakes over and over again. The mistake comes from thinking that people always behave rationally. I used to think so until I saw the smartest, richest people. The most educated people make the most bizarre decisions. Why so? Because there is one thing that most people refuse to accept. The truth sometimes does not prevail, victory is a more interesting story. One reason we keep repeating the same mistakes is because we overestimate logic and underestimate instinct. An investor can have excellent financial knowledge, but if they cannot control their greed or panic, they will be defeated by their own emotions. It's not their fault, it's the fault of expectations. Expect that if you know enough, you will make the right decision. In fact, the opposite is true. You can understand the problem clearly and still act wrongly. If you don't understand yourself, think about times of market turmoil. Reason tells you to hold the stock but fear whispers to sell or you will lose everything. And most people listen to that whisper, not the voice from the textbook. Because emotions come before reason and emotions usually win. Human fragility is most evident when we feel everything is fine. Oddly enough, the plateau is often fertile ground for crazy things to happen. When we forget what fear feels like, we start doing stupid things without even realizing it. Like a man standing in the desert and saying, "I don't see any signs of a tornado, there probably won't be one." And then not bothering to carry a compass in business or politics. What makes the biggest changes often starts with the smallest and most ordinary things. Complacency. People think that because things are going well, they will continue to go well. They forget that the cycle of madness often begins with a moment of too much peace. I've been asked why the biggest disasters always take us by surprise. The answer is because it's not like everyday fear. It's not loud, it's not warning, it doesn't knock on the door. It just slips in through the cracks in seemingly rational decisions. In our overconfidence, in our indifference to risk, every great disaster was once a small, overlooked behavior. And then, strangely enough, when the panic passes, people do the same thing again, as if history had never happened. You can write thousands of there are dozens of profound analyses after every financial crisis, but someone will still make the same mistake. Only with a new logo, a new suit, and a newer iPhone. Here's the irony. The only thing that doesn't change is that people think everything has changed. We always think the world today is unprecedented, but if you step back far enough, you'll see it's all just a repeat, maybe a different name, a different face, but the same essence. There's a strange allure to numbers. It makes us think everything is measurable, controllable, and predictable. But if you've worked with data long enough, you'll know that the most important numbers are often the ones we don't see. And sometimes it's the absence of numbers that's scariest. The hardest part of any game isn't understanding the rules, it's understanding what game you're playing. Some people play to win, some play to survive, some don't know what they're playing, they simply copy the other person. Edge. And that's what makes the game so dangerous. When you're running a marathon and looking at someone else it seems like you're running a sprint. Let me tell you something else. A difficult paradox to swallow. Pessimism is more attractive than optimism. Why? Because it makes us feel smart when someone's hungry. Everything will fall apart. We see that person as a wise man. And the person who says everything will be okay is naive. But if you look back at history, you'll see that despite all the tragedies, the world moved forward, people survived. And the future, though imperfect, is more hopeful than we imagine. Rationality is ideal, but rationality often trumps comfort. And in many cases, people don't need the best solution. They just need the solution that lets them sleep at night. Next, I want you to imagine a paradox. The greatest disasters in history often come not from cruelty but from naivety. From someone believing they can get results, that if they try hard enough, plan enough, everything will work out. But the world doesn't work like math. It's like a river, and you can't control the flow. You can only learn to climb through it. I've seen brilliant investors lose money because they try to calculate every single variable. While those who are less educated but know their limits and understand them survive longer. That's not a coincidence, it's a testament to an underlying rule. Sometimes absolute rationality is a trap. Because life rarely follows strict logic, and people don't. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a forest. You have a map, a compass, a flashlight. But if you don't understand the principle of the forest, that it's constantly changing, that there are creatures you've never met, that you'll never see all the turns, then all the tools are meaningless. In business, it's the same, you can have data, models, strategies. But if you don't understand human nature, greed, fear, and impulse, you're just a lamplighter in the fog of success. In many cases, success doesn't come from knowing more, it comes from doing less, from being less confident, from reacting less, from having less illusion of control. People who are consistently successful are not the ones who win every bet, but the ones who know when to stand up, leave the table, and keep their capital alive. It's a funny fact that most of the things that make us fail are things we've been warned about but still do. Why? Because it doesn't sound like experience. You can read hundreds of pieces of advice on saving, investing, controlling your emotions. But it's only when you lose real money, get scammed, or go through a real crisis that you learn what it really means. People don't learn rationally, people learn through pain, and that's why history repeats itself. There are things I can't help but think about every time I watch the market go up and down. Or when a fledgling entrepreneur, when people talk about reshaping the world, they don't realize that much of what they think is new has already happened. But with a different name, a different packaging, a shinier logo, take the financial bubble. People often say it's the result of greed, which is true but not enough. The root of the bubble is that people want to believe in a beautiful story that this time is different, that old limits have been broken, that they, the better educated, the smarter, won't make the same mistakes as the previous generation. But they do because confidence is a drug. It gives you a sense of control but blinds you to risk. After the bubble bursts, when everything collapses, people try to create a new story. As if the previous failure was an accident rather than an inevitable consequence. The cycle begins again. If you've ever made a bad bet, lost a business, believed in something so blindly that you now look back with bitterness, congratulations. Congratulations, you are growing up. And that growth doesn't come from being better than everyone else. It comes from not believing you are always right. Let me tell you something else. I was once asked if I could teach my kids only one thing about money, what would it be? It didn't take me long to answer. I said, know the game you are playing and don't play the game other people are playing. Because most financial mistakes come from looking at the person next to us and thinking we should do the same. The other person bought shares, I also bought. The other person invests in real estate, I do too. But we don't know that their goals are different, their circumstances are different, their risk limits are different, and yet we take their actions as our standards. As a result, we play a game we don't understand and lose in ways we didn't expect. So the most important thing is not to find the best investment formula but to find the game that suits you best and play it patiently. Even when someone else is celebrating a short-term win in another game. And then at some point along the way, you'll realize a strange truth. Most of what we call surprises are actually things we take for granted. Think about all the shocks that markets, society, and even personal lives can bring. They don't fall from the sky, they always leave a mark. It's just that we didn't care or didn't want to care. Because stability creates the illusion of security. And when we believe that things will always be the same, that's when we start to fall into a spiral. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And the funny thing is that each generation thinks it is immune to the mistakes of the previous generation. We have technology, we have big data, we learn from the past. It all sounds convincing until you see people reenacting the exact same behavior, overborrowing. Invest in groups of 7, buy high sell low, excitement then panic. It's not because we're more stupid, it's because we're still human and humans can't escape instinct. Things like greed, jealousy, and fear of being left behind are always stronger than any logical reasoning. I was once asked, why don't you try to predict the market? And I answer, because the most reliable thing is not prediction but human nature. And human nature is very consistent. We always react to risk the same way, always underestimating what we cannot see. Always too optimistic when things are good, always panic too quickly when things go bad. That's why I've always believed that to understand the future, don't ask what will change. Ask what will stay the same. If you are an investor, this is even more important. There are thousands of indicator models and algorithms created to predict trends, but most of them become ineffective after just a few years. Meanwhile, simple principles like saving more than spending, diversifying, avoiding bad debt, and being patient have endured through the generations. Why? Because they rely on the only thing that doesn't change. People will always expect too much, act too emotionally, and underestimate randomness. There was a moment I'll never forget when I heard a friend say, "I'd rather be wrong in the crowd than right, alone." That quote stuck with me because it's true for millions of people out there. People who don't want to be separated from the crowd, even when the crowd is rushing into the abyss. It's easy to be convinced that everyone else is doing it, which means it must be right. But the truth is that the crowd is often right in the short term and often wrong in the long term. Because the crowd is impatient, the crowd can't stand boredom, the crowd can't accept personal mistakes, so it's easy to get swept up in the collective emotion. And that's why the most successful investors are often the ones who can endure the feeling of loneliness. They can watch the market go up and still not jump in. You can see your friends making money fast and still not change their strategy, not because they are arrogant but because they understand that nothing is sustainable if it goes against themselves. And you know what? There's something even harder. Patience is the ability to say no to tempting opportunities. Knowing that you could make a lot of money quickly and choosing not to. Just because it doesn't fit with who you are. It's a very quiet but lasting kind of strength. In a world where everyone is always trying to be special, the person who knows how to live simply is the most remarkable. Because he doesn't chase the spotlight, isn't fascinated by short-term wins, isn't obsessed with being better than everyone else, he just does his thing, day in and day out, relentlessly. And in that simplicity, there's a profound truth. Most great advances are made by small, repeated, unnoticed actions, without fireworks, without speeches, without headlines, just regularity. Something almost boring but cumulatively over time produces extraordinary results. Look at nature. A seed doesn't need to scream to sprout. A river doesn't need to make noise to wear away. Stone. The greatest power is often the quietest. And that is true in human life as well. The people who make the biggest changes are often not the loudest, but the most steadfast, even in silence. If you ever feel like you are falling behind because you are not participating in some financial craze, ask yourself who you are racing against. Do you have the same goals as them? Or are you letting the fear of missing out control your actions? Because that fear is what has burned so many fortunes, so many lives. Not because people lack information, but because they lack composure. The fear of being left behind is one of the most powerful motivators I have ever seen. It can make smart people act stupidly because it appeals to their self-esteem, to their sense of being inferior to others. And so we rush in. Without checking, without assessing the risks, without thinking about the consequences. We simply do not want to be forgotten. But the paradox is that the only person you should fear is being left behind you is the best version of yourself. Not your neighbor, not your friend on social media, not even your old classmate who is showing off his achievements. Any comparison outside of yourself is a losing game. Because you can never know the whole picture of others. You only see the surface, only see the success, not see the price they have to pay, not see the hidden fears, not see the sleepless nights, and you use that as a yardstick for yourself. Think about it. If you can't feel enough with what you have, you will never feel enough with what you will have. Because the problem is not in assets, it is in feelings. And feelings come from comparison. Cut off comparison, you will have freedom. I once asked an elderly person who had been through many crises what he regretted the most. He didn't talk about investments, didn't talk about careers, but about the times he lived without really being present. I was too worried about the future, too obsessed with achievement to the point of not realizing that we have missed the most important thing. At this moment, when we are young, we think that time is endless, so we waste it. When we grow up, we realize that time is limited, but we do not know how to use it. When we die, we want to go back to relive each moment, but it is too late. And paradoxically, we only realize that when time is no longer there. That is why I think the most important life skill is not planning, not making money, but the ability to be present, the ability to choose to live in each moment. No worries, no regrets, not being pulled back to the past or pushed into the future. Simply being here, right now, with all that we have, but that skill is extremely difficult. Because our minds are always pulled by information, by expectations, by noise from the world, you need to be selective, need to learn to say no, need to dare to cut out things that do not serve your deep self. Because focus does not come from, it's not about trying to do more, but about daring to do less, to think less, to chase less, to have more for the things that really matter. And you'll see an interesting thing happen when you actually start to do less. You become lighter not only physically but also mentally. You no longer feel like you have to compete with the world. You no longer feel like you're being dragged down by standards that are made to make you feel inadequate. You begin to see clearly what's yours, what's fake, what's worth your time, and what's not worth even a breath. In the financial world, this is more evident than ever. Look at the people who have achieved true financial freedom. They're not the ones with the most assets. They're the ones who want the least. They're the ones who have seen the big picture and realized that happiness doesn't come from having more, but from needing less. There's a story I'll always remember. A friend of mine used to work at a large hedge fund in New York, where everyone was made millions of dollars. But he himself, after achieving the number he dreamed of, fell into crisis. Not because he lost money, but because he no longer knew what he was living for. All he knew was running. Running to be better than others, running to not be left behind, but never stopping to ask where he was running. And at some point, that question came back fierce and empty like a cave. He quit his job and moved to a small town. Not because he failed, but because he finally understood. Speed is meaningless if you go in the wrong direction. I share this because I see it repeated everywhere. In startups that burn out, in people who rush into investment projects without understanding anything. In families that are broken because one person is always absent to take care of the future. In people who realize at the end of their lives that what they sacrificed is something they cannot buy back. And if there is anything I want to emphasize, it is that the price of a choice is not just money, but time, and attention, trust, relationships. And when you spend them on things that don't really matter, no matter how successful you are, it's a lost battle. If you ever feel like you're spinning around endlessly, try stopping for a moment, not to give up but to check your direction. Because there are mistakes that can only be recognized when we step back far enough, and there are truths that can only appear when we are quiet enough to listen to ourselves. The art of living is not about filling up the schedule, but knowing how to fill the necessary gaps. Because it is in that free time that we have time to look back, to connect, to create, and sometimes to love without rushing. Because in the end, when you look back on your life, you won't remember the times you worked 20 hours a day to achieve your goals. You will remember the moments you laughed with someone you loved. The evenings doing nothing but chatting, the trips without plans but full of life. The times you lived truly, not acting, not forcing, not trying to prove anything. Those are the things that will remain when everything else is gone. And that is also the reason I wrote this book. Not to give advice but to share what I have seen, lived, learned, sometimes at great cost. I am not sure that everyone will agree. But if just one person reads it and sees a little reflection of themselves in it, I believe it is enough. There is another aspect that I ignored for many years, until it became too obvious. The way we tell stories is the way we understand the world. Humans do not live by facts, we live by stories. And the danger is that a good enough story can make us believe the wrong things. I have seen investors put all their money into a company that was nothing special. Just because they were attracted by a beautiful story that this was revolutionary, a first in history, an opportunity not to be missed. We are easily fooled by words, by images, by how people say things rather than what they say. That made me understand. The winner in every game is not the one with the best argument, but the one with the most believable story. And that is true not only in finance but also in life, politics, education, media. Look at everything you believe in. Do you believe it because it is true or because it is told in a way that makes you feel secure, interested, or sympathetic? We are not trained to question the truth. We are raised on stories, so what makes us make decisions is not logic but the emotions triggered by the story. So what we need to learn is not just how to think, but how to listen. Learn to distinguish between facts and interpretations, between truth and sugar-coated stories. And once we see that, we will no longer be easily swept away by waves we do not understand. But the important thing is that we also tell stories to ourselves. Every day we interpret our lives through the colors of dialogue. Inner self. I am a failure. I am not good enough, I have not done anything right. Repeated enough times, these statements become truth in the mind. And then, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, they become the way we act. It took me many years to realize that I do not need to be the main character in a perfect story. I just need to be the one to tell it honestly, courageously, and humanly. Without embellishment, without hiding, without pretending to be tough. Because it is that vulnerability, if told truthfully, that will touch others. There is another thing I have noticed through many years of observation. Most of the big changes in people's lives do not come from a violent turn. They come from a series of small, almost invisible movements. Like water seeping through rocks, like tree roots creeping underground, like habits repeating themselves without anyone noticing. People often look for a great moment of awakening. But in reality, such moments rarely happen. Instead, you will gradually change little by little. When you live long enough in awareness, when you begin to see the patterns, when you accept that there are things you can't control and let go of the need to control them. I used to try to control everything, my finances, my career, my schedule, my emotions. I thought that was the way to live effectively. But then I realized that the most beautiful things in my life didn't come from plans. They came from surprises, from things that went beyond my expectations, from chance relationships, from unexpected failures, from turns that I once considered mistakes, but opened doors I never dared to think of. That's why I started slowing down. Not because I lost ambition, but because I realized. I don't want to rush to a place I don't want to go. And when you slow down, you start to see things that you used to pass by. A caring look, a gentle touch, a pause between two breaths. You start to realize that life is not a series of achievements but is a web of connections. And the real value of a person's life is not how many stairs you climb, but how many hearts you touch, including your own. In recent years, I have come to understand that one of the most important capacities in life is not the capacity to persuade or lead or make money, but the capacity to accept uncertainty. Because everything worthwhile in life, love, trust, opportunity, involves risk. You cannot love without the fear of being hurt. You cannot trust without the possibility of being betrayed. You cannot jump at an opportunity without the risk of failure. So what separates the courageous from the avoidant is not knowledge, but the ability to live with uncertainty in investing. It is the ability to tolerate volatility in relationships. It is the ability to love someone without controlling them. In life, it is the ability to take a step without knowing for sure that you are on the right path. Because sometimes the right path is only revealed after you have taken the step. And that is what makes me believe more and more that living well is not about living without fear, but living with fear and still moving forward. There is a close example that I always use when talking about uncertainty, which is parenting. There is no course that is enough to prepare you. There is no map that tells you how to react in each situation. You can only learn by living, by making mistakes, correcting, listening and loving unconditionally. And the wonderful thing is that in that journey, you grow not because you are better but because you become softer, more humble, more human. Likewise, any area of life, investing, work, relationships, health requires you to learn from within. No one can teach you how to live. They can only tell their story, and you have to write your own. I share this not to explain but to invite you to look back. How many things are you postponing just because you are waiting for certainty? How many the choices you've passed up because you didn't have enough information? The important conversations that didn't happen. Because you weren't sure how the other person would react. But the truth is, there will never be absolute certainty. And if you wait until you do, you might wait forever. So sometimes the bravest thing to do isn't to jump out of a plane or invest all your savings, but to say I don't know, I'm scared, I need help. Because in a world that expects strength and control, vulnerability becomes an act of revolution. I don't know where you are in life. You might be wildly successful or in a dark chapter. But I want you to know this. Everyone is struggling with something they don't say. So if you're tired, it doesn't mean you're on the wrong path. You might just be on the real path. And in that real journey, there's something I've learned that no one ever taught me: life doesn't need to be, it always has to mean something big. Sometimes making a cup of tea in the morning, sitting and watching the sunlight through the curtains is a victory. Sometimes replying to a text from an old friend or hugging someone tightly without explanation is an act of healing. We grow up with images of heroes, people who do great things, change the world. And so we are pressured to be someone. But no one tells us that being yourself, being kind, being steadfast, being quiet is sometimes the most extraordinary thing. I used to think that to live a life of value, I had to do something big. A bestseller, a big idea, a speech that touched thousands of people. But the longer I live, the more I realize that the most valuable thing is to live what you believe in every little detail. And what changes the world is not a grand declaration, but a quiet action repeated every day. Like the father who is never late to pick up his children, but the mother who still gets up early cooking breakfast even though no one compliments you. Like a friend sending a text asking how things are going, like a teacher taking extra time to listen to a troubled student. These are actions that never make the front page of a newspaper. But they change the world little by little. A friend once told me, everyone wants to leave a mark, but sometimes leaving a smile is enough. And I found that true. Because in the darkest moments of my life, what pulled me back was not theory or money or success but someone who stayed with me, said nothing, just sat there. And that's when I understood, presence is the greatest gift you can give someone. No advice, no solutions, just presence, complete, unconditional. You don't need to have all the answers. You just have to dare to be there when the question is asked. And that's something very few people dare to do. Because something in modern society makes us think we have to be strong all the time, always know the way, always control emotions. But in fact, life is a series of blurred areas and wisdom does not come from removing that blurred area but from learning to live in it. Not resisting, not avoiding, not pretending it doesn't exist, just living with it. I am also finding my way like you. And if there is anything worth sharing, it is what I have seen on that journey. And when I look back on all the years that have passed, I don't remember clearly the data tables, the investment results or the career milestones. What I remember is the feeling. The feeling of being trusted, of being shared, of being present at the right time with the right person. The moments when I sat in a small room that no one knew about, but my heart was strangely peaceful. Because I know that even though there is nothing flashy, I am still living truthfully. This world does not lack talented people, does not lack successful people. What it lacks are people brave enough to be honest about their fears, about their limits, about their hurts, about the fact that sometimes they do not know what to do. What to do next, and it is that honesty. Unpretentious, unadorned, that makes others stop, listen and feel seen. There are things I used to think were weaknesses. Now I see them as strengths, the courage to apologize when I was wrong, the courage to change when I felt it was not right, the courage to refuse something attractive just because it did not suit me, the courage to choose a life with less noise. Even if that means not being admired as much as before, it took me many years to understand. A good life is not a life that many people approve of, but a life where you do not have to pretend. Where you do not have to strain yourself to fit a mold. Where you can say I don't know without fear of being looked down upon. Where you can fail without having to hide it. And the strange thing is that when you live like that, sincerely, honestly, not trying to impress, you start to attract people like you and you create a space where others are allowed to be themselves too. Unpretentious, uncompetitive, unfearful fear. That's where true friendships begin, that's where true love is nurtured, that's where true meaning grows. And the best part is, you don't need anyone's permission to live this way. You just have to choose a little bit each day. Start small. Say that thank you forgot to say, send that text to someone you've grown apart from. Give yourself a break without feeling guilty. Choose to do the right thing even when no one is watching. These are the actions that don't make the headlines but change you inside in lasting ways. And if you keep doing that, little by little, you will look back and see. It turns out I don't need to do anything great to live a great life. I just need to live each day. Not much, just enough. Because in a world where everyone is trying to stand out, the one who lives fully in silence will be the one who stays the longest. And then as the last days of the first part of your life begin to close, you realize something so simple that almost no one talks about it. That life is not about winning but about feeling, choosing, witnessing everything. The good and the bad, the joy and the pain. And still choose to keep going. Even though there are no guarantees ahead, you will remember the times you laughed so hard your stomach hurt and the times you cried silently that no one knew. You will remember foolish mistakes that, looking back, opened important doors in your life. You will realize that everything that happens, even the things you once wanted to run away from, is a part of you and nothing is extra. I used to think that wisdom came from knowing a lot. Now I think it comes from understanding your limits and from accepting that there will always be things you can never control, like other people's emotions, like time, like the future. If you have ever read books about getting rich, leadership, or self-improvement, you will see one thing in common. Everything is packaged as a system, with goals, with metrics, with measures. But life is not that simple. There are days when just getting through is good enough. There are months when you can't get anything done. But that's when you learn the most about yourself. And that can't be quantified, that can't be funded, that can't be advertised. But it is the core, the real thing, the thing that never changes. So when you ask me, what will remain the same, no matter how the world changes, this is my answer. There will always be people who act on emotion rather than reason. There will always be people who are more caught up in the story than the truth. There will always be cycles of excitement and disappointment. Then excited again. There will always be people who think this time will be different, and there will always be people who repeat the same mistakes. Just because they have never experienced the real pain from those mistakes. But along with all of that, there will always be people who learn from silence, learn from loss, learn from daring to be honest with themselves even though it is not comfortable at all. And if you are one of those people, imperfect but sincere, then you are on the right track. Even though that road has no spotlights, no applause, no concubines. But it has depth and it is real. I write to you not to show you the way but to say that I am also going with you step by step, mistake by mistake, moment by moment. If we don't rush, if we don't run after things, if we are patient with ourselves, then in the end we will look back and know that we have lived a life that is true to ourselves. And that in this ever-changing world is what counts the most. If there is a force so strong that it makes the world spin endlessly, then that is the hidden motivation behind all self-interested behavior. Not faith, not ideals, not ethics, just plain interest. People will act in a certain way, not because it is right, but because it is beneficial to them. At that moment, you can preach morality all day, but if the listener feels that they are at a disadvantage by following it, your words will fly away like the wind. I have seen organizations torn apart from within. Not because they don't have common values, but because each individual is secretly playing a separate game with its own rewards. They say the right thing, do something else for personal gain against the common goal. And the scary thing is that most of the time they don't realize they're doing it because the human brain is very good at convincing itself. It can distort reasoning just to make us feel right. You can see that anywhere. From politics, finance to everyday social media controversies. People always think they are right. And when you think you are right, you will never find yourself having selfish motives. But the reality is that everyone acts for some benefit. It could be money, it could be the feeling of recognition, it could be the need to protect one's self-image. And unless we look at it, acknowledge it, work with it, not deny it, we will never understand how the world works. That's why I always ask the question, what is this person's motive for saying what they say? What do they get if I believe them? What do they lose if I don't believe? And more importantly, am I looking at things through the lens of my own self-interest? Because benefits not only shape behavior, they shape perception. Two people can look at the same facts and draw completely opposite conclusions, simply because each person is standing from a different position of interest. And then they will argue to the end, believing they are defending the truth, while they are only protecting their own reward. Realizing that doesn't make you cynical at all, on the contrary, it makes you more realistic. And the reality is, if you want anything to last, a relationship, an organization, an agreement, you have to make sure that everyone wins, that nobody gets left out, that nobody gets made out to be stupid for doing the right thing. Because if someone feels like they have to sacrifice too much without getting recognized, sooner or later they will withdraw or ruin the game. And this is true even in our relationship with ourselves. You can't force yourself to do something long-term if part of you finds it pointless. You have to make peace with your inner self. Understand that we live not only by ideals but also by very human motivations. Want to see results, want to be rewarded, want to feel valued. And when you begin to see life as a series of intertwined dynamics, sometimes harmonious, sometimes contradictory, you will better understand why people disagree, and more importantly, you will not be surprised by that anymore. Because disagreement is not a system error, it is a default property of the system. We live in a world where everyone is playing a different game with different rules, different expectations and different rewards. Take the example of financial markets. Some people invest to retire after 20 years. Some people invest to surf for 2 weeks. Someone is hedging. Someone is looking to salvage a huge loss. And they all buy, sell, and value the same stocks. So how can there be a single truth about the value of that property? Therefore, the most dangerous thing is when we think others are stupid just because they act differently from us. Because maybe they're just playing a different game. And if we try to convince them according to the logic of the game we are playing, it is not persuasion but coercion. I used to think that wisdom was having the ability to convince others to agree with you. But now I believe that wisdom is knowing when to be silent, when to let others go the way they need to go, the way they need to experience. Because most lessons in life cannot be taught, they can only be felt. And from there, we begin to understand why this world, despite billions of books and millions of pieces of advice, still cannot prevent people from repeating mistakes. Because advice is universal but experience is personal. No one learns from another, at least not deeply. People will still overinvest, still spend to impress, still marry the wrong person, choose the wrong career, and misjudge themselves. Not because of lack of information, but because they have not yet touched a pain or joy big enough to change. And when we understand that, we find ourselves softening, becoming less judgmental, more observant, and sometimes patient enough to sit with someone while they struggle without trying to fix them. Because the ironic but painful truth is that the smartest people are often the hardest to change. It's not because they are stubborn, it's because they are so good at justifying their behavior. They can justify themselves with a whole system of reasoning that makes them think they are moving forward, while actually just revolving in the comfort zone of the mind. And that's why real change happens, whether in individuals or organizations, rarely comes from a complex strategy. It often comes from a very human moment. A silent look in the mirror, a defenseless conversation, a fall that cracks the shell of pride, or simply someone sitting down and asking if you're okay and really wanting to hear the answer. And when we talk about change, we often think of big turning points, bold decisions, and dramatic comebacks. But the truth is that profound change is rarely noisy. It did not scream, it seeped, slowly, seeping like water through rock. It starts when you find yourself no longer excited about what used to excite you, when you get tired of the race you used to love. When you start to question the things you once took for granted. It's not a crisis. It is the beginning of a new level of awareness, and it often comes with a sense of loss. Because you start to feel strange to your old self. You start to distance yourself from people you used to be close to. You no longer want to engage in empty conversations. No more pretending to agree, no more trying to act like you're okay when you're really not. And so you feel lonely. But that is not the loneliness to avoid. It is the loneliness that needs to be passed through to filter, to settle, to regenerate. Like the winter of the soul, without it there would be no spring of maturity. I have seen it in the people I love most. A friend of mine, who used to be a star in the investment industry, decided to quit his job, give up his fame, and move back to teach in the countryside. People laughed and called him a quitter. But he just said one sentence: I don't give up. I give up what's not me anymore. And I think that's one of the bravest things I've ever seen. Because most of us don't give up because we don't know, but because we're afraid of losing recognition, we're afraid of being seen as failures, we're afraid of falling behind. But if you live to maintain your image, sooner or later you'll lose yourself. This world will constantly call you to be more, faster, more outstanding. But you always have the right to step off the stage, turn inward, slow down, not to achieve anything but to feel again what you missed on the track. And the magic is when you live like that, you begin to see things that were once invisible: a ray of sunshine on the roof, a sincere hello, a kindness no one witnessed. And you realize that maybe what makes this life worthwhile is not the peaks but the small things that people don't bother to tell. But you remember forever. And then when you start paying attention to the little things, you realize a simple but often overlooked truth. Most of the great things in life come not from outstanding effort but from unseen persistence, from doing the right thing over and over again in silence. Even when no one is watching, even when no one is cheering, and especially even when you're not sure if it's working. We live in an age obsessed with quick results. Everything has to have evidence, statistics, and impact. Otherwise, we hesitate to do it. We see it as a waste of time, but there are things you can't measure by effectiveness. Like a hug at the right time, like listening to someone pour out their heart, like a decision to forgive. Those things don't show up on an Excel spreadsheet, but they change a person from the inside in ways that no data can describe. So don't underestimate what you do just because it doesn't resonate. You may not change the world, but if you change one person, soothe a pain, open a new path in a blocked soul, then you have done what many great people fail to do. And then you will see a strange thing happen. When you stop trying to be important, you become more significant not because you are mentioned but because you begin to touch the truest part of others. And that, the feeling of being useful without fanfare, is both humbling and powerful. I used to think that to have influence you needed a big vision, you needed to do something no one else was doing. Now I see that true influence is when you dare to be right in a world of compromise. When you keep your heart soft while your mind is clear. When you are brave enough not to follow the crowd. But you don't have to shout to prove it. One of the biggest lessons I have learned in life is that being right is rarely sexy. It doesn't come with excitement. It doesn't give you instant rewards. Often it leaves you feeling lost. Because doing the right thing, it's not hard. What's hard is to continue doing the right thing when everyone around you is doing the wrong thing and getting praised. And that's why consistency is valuable. Not mechanical consistency, but principled consistency. You know what's important to you and you stick to it not because it's easy but because you don't want to betray yourself. You don't have to be the best, but if you're the one who stays true to yourself after all, you've won in a way that no one else can recognize. And you'll see this more clearly when you look back at the relationships in your life. Who makes you feel safe? Not the one who's always right, always talented, or always has good advice. It's the one who doesn't judge you when you're wrong. The one who sits there when you have nothing to be proud of. The one who doesn't try to fix you, but just listens quietly. They don't need to teach you anything because their presence is a reminder. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. Likewise, what you leave in others is not knowledge. It's a feeling. Do they feel heard, respected, valued when they're with you? Because that feeling will stay with them forever, longer than any words. And in a world that's increasingly cold and calculating, the ability to make others feel safe becomes a special kind of power. It doesn't come from skill or strategy. It comes from going deep enough into yourself. Sitting with your fear long enough that it no longer controls you. And so you don't need other people to be okay before you love them. I used to think maturity was when I knew more. But now I see maturity as having less to prove. It's when I don't feel the need to win every argument. It's when I'm at peace enough inside that I don't get dragged down by every comment, every compliment, every criticism. And that frees me not from fear but from the need to avoid it. I no longer need to be loved all the time, no longer need to do the right thing all the time, I just need to be someone who is trying honestly. There is a strange paradox in the journey of growing up when you stop trying to be better than everyone else. You actually become more trustworthy because others can sense that you are being real, and the truth, though quiet, always has its own frequency, and those who are looking for it will recognize you. You don't have to shine in the traditional sense. There are people who bring light just by being there, not taking up space, not doing well, but being stable enough that everyone around them feels calm. That's the kind of person I want to be, not the leader but the person who makes those around me feel safe enough to lead their own way. And at some point, when you begin to understand more deeply the invisible dynamics that operate beneath people and society, you will see clearly, something often overlooked, that most of our decisions are not based on pure reason but on the instinct of belonging. Nothing motivates people more strongly than the fear of being excluded from the group. Not the fear of poverty, not the fear of failure, but the fear of being left out, of being isolated, of being seen as different. I used to think I was independent. I used to pride myself on not following the crowd. Until I realized I was silent in a conversation where I should have spoken because I didn't want to cause trouble. I nodded to a plan I didn't agree with. Because I was afraid of being seen as negative. And I found that the so-called independence was just a facade. Deep down, I was just as hungry to belong, to be accepted as anyone else. And this isn't a weakness, it's our nature. Because we're programmed to live together, not apart. But it's also that which makes us vulnerable to being drawn into communities that aren't really right for us because they offer a false sense of security. A team, a company, a group of friends, a group of shareholders, where you're forced to share an ideology. Even if you feel something is wrong in your heart, and if you're not careful, the needing to be accepted will make you compromise too much. You will start to doubt your intuition. You will edit yourself to fit in, little by little. You will lose your individuality not in one big betrayal but in a series of silent nods. Until one day you look in the mirror and see a familiar yet unfamiliar face. You realize you have strayed too far from where you started. Not geographically, but in terms of identity. But trust me. You don't have to stay there. You can always go back, you don't have to leave it all. Sometimes it's just about starting to tell the truth, starting to ask why, starting to share your feelings even if they contradict the group, and if the group can't handle that honesty, then maybe. That's not where you need to belong. Because where you really belong is where you don't have to compromise your honesty to keep your place, where differences are welcomed. Unfixed is where you can be yourself, not a tweaked version to be more comfortable. And to find that place, you have to brave some very lonely moments. Where no one understands you, where you have no side. But if you make it through, you will build a real community. Small but strong enough that you don't have to act anymore. And when you have tasted what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be excluded, to be seen as too different, you begin to develop a special kind of compassion, not pity for the weak but a deep empathy for those who are also trying to live authentically in a world that prefers consensus. You are no longer so quick to label others as weird, misfits, extremists. You wonder what brought them here. What pain made them retreat or scream? What betrayal of trust made them build a shell around themselves? And it is that empathy that changes every conversation. Because you no longer speak to win but to understand. You no longer listen to argue but to receive. And sometimes all it takes is your presence. Not trying to fix them is enough to soften a heart that has been hardened by being judged for too long. I used to think that if I wanted to change others, I had to convince them with solid arguments. But now I believe that what moves people the most is the feeling of being listened to without being condemned, of being seen without being defined, of being present without being adjusted. That is something very rare and very precious. And you know, when you live like that, you will also start to treat yourself that way. You will no longer berate yourself every time you stumble, no longer force yourself to always be positive, always productive, always strong. You will learn to be with yourself, no advice, no escape, just presence. And in that presence you heal. Because it turns out that what we need most is not to be saved but to be accompanied. Not someone to solve things for us but someone to stay when we are broken, conflicted, and confused. And if you have ever been the one who was not allowed to stay, the one who was abandoned fall at the most fragile moment, I want to tell you this. You deserve a space where you don't have to be okay to be loved. You deserve relationships where the truth is welcomed, not edited. And if you haven't found that place yet, you can start with yourself, create that place for others, be the first person who dares to stay, dares to listen, dares not to leave. And from there you will attract people who can do the same. Then at some point you will realize that you are no longer alone. And then you begin to understand that there are things that don't need to be overcome, but just lived with. Not all sadness needs to be erased. Not all wounds need to heal completely. There are pains that will stay forever as a part of you. Not to torture but to remind. You once lived so deeply that you could be truly hurt. We grew up with the concept of recovery as a straight line going up, but the reality is much more winding. There were days when you thought you were okay. A song, a scent, a random sentence pulls you back to the place you thought you had left and you wonder why you haven't overcome it yet. The answer is because you don't need to overcome it. You just need to learn to carry it and still live. Like carrying a stone in your pocket. It has weight but you no longer let it hinder your every step. And sometimes that stone itself becomes a reminder. Live more kindly, slower, listen more. I've seen that the strongest people are not those who never fall down but those who fall and still come back. Not with a halo but with softer eyes. They don't need to declare victory. They don't need anyone to praise them, they just live quietly, knowing that living honestly with themselves is enough. And you will see that when you live with that gentleness, not only with others but with yourself, you begin to approach the world with a kind of wisdom that cannot be learned from books. The wisdom of someone who has lost, made mistakes, and struggled in the dark. And still choose to love again. That is the wisdom of someone who understands that not every question needs an answer. Sometimes all we need is someone to sit with us in silence without leaving. And maybe that is what you can give someone today. Not solutions, not advice, just being present with a look that says I don't know where you're going, but I believe you'll find your way. And when you've lived long enough with the inexplicable, you begin to stop forcing everything to have a higher meaning. You no longer need every incident to lead to a profound lesson. Every failure must be rewarded. Every loss must open a door. You accept that some things are just sad and that's it. They don't need to be justified, they don't need to be right when they happen, you hurt and then you move on. That's enough. That is not pessimism. On the contrary, it is the foundation of a mature optimism. An optimism that is not based on hoping for everything will always be good but based on the belief that you can continue living even when things are not good. It is an unpretentious perseverance, a kind of strength that comes from having lost but not letting it turn you into a bitter person. And when you no longer demand order in life, you begin to see a very special, soft, vague order. But is it true, like the way kind people often meet each other, like the way those who live sincerely even though they are hurt in front of them often have a deeper life later, like the way things you once did not understand gradually reveal their meaning not in that moment but many years later in a completely different situation, and when you live long enough, you begin to believe in the so-called underground current that there is a certain flow that guides everything even when you do not see it. It is not fate, it is not the universe's arrangement, it is just a gentle logic of time, where everything, even the most meaningless things, has its place. You do not need to understand everything, you just need to live enough be honest with every experience. Because that honesty is what connects all the disparate parts of your life into a story. Not a perfect story, but a true story. And a true story is always valuable. Not because it is complete, but because it is alive. I don't know where you are on your journey. But I believe that if you can still be gentle with yourself, still be able to look at others without judgment, still be able to feel sadness without closing it off, then you are doing better than you think. And if there are times when you feel tired, feel lost, remember that not everyone goes fast, some go deep. And sometimes it is the slowest steps that leave the longest traces. And when you reach the end of a journey, you will realize the paradox that few people talk about: the most important things in life are not what you achieve but what you keep, not the heights you have reached but the being you still keep after going through it all. In the midst of being swept up in the crowd, mesmerized by the applause, swept up in the endless race, you still keep a part of yourself that is not eroded, not replaced, not distorted. That part is the real you. That is what makes you different. Not talent, not achievements, but the consistency of the soul amid changing circumstances. A kind of gravity, silent but steadfast. That keeps you upright in a world that is gradually drifting away. And you begin to understand why ordinary people can become extraordinary. Not because they are superior, but because they do not lose their honesty with themselves. Even when they have every reason to do otherwise. They may be quiet, but inside they have a core. And that core that does not waver with public opinion, does not change color with the times, is what makes them a pillar. For others. They are the kind of people who do not need to say much, but you will want to be around not to learn but just to be by their side. They do not say be strong, they are strong, but their presence makes you stronger. They don't need inspiration. But when they tell their stories, you feel empowered. I think that's the greatest thing a person can do to make the world live true to themselves so calmly that others feel safe to be themselves. No competition, no performance, no trying to be better than anyone else. Just an honest life lived to the fullest. And if after all, you look back and see that you have kept your heart gentle, your heart open, and your gaze clear, then you have lived a full life. There are things that remain unchanged no matter how the times change. And those things, honesty, patience, kindness, quiet perseverance, are the true foundation of a life worth living. The rest is all just background. Thank you for accompanying me. Not just to listen to a book, but to think together, to slow down together, to go through the thin layers of dust of reality to reach things that never change. Change. See as ever doesn't offer quick answers. It doesn't promise formulas, it doesn't encourage you to become someone new. On the contrary, it invites you back to yourself. Not through roles, back to human nature, not through theoretical shells, back to what was once considered too simple to be credible. If you've listened to this last line, I believe you're not just a reader but a seeker. Not looking for difference to stand out but looking for the constant to stand firm. I hope that after all you don't leave with a list of actions but with a deeper sense of the quiet but persistent pulse of life. Where the old turns out to be the most trustworthy. If you find this book worth pondering, please leave a review. Not to grade but to extend the conversation so that others, who are also searching, can find it as you did. And if you have another book in your heart, a question, if you have any unanswered questions or concerns that you would like to be answered, please do not hesitate to suggest them. I do not promise to have the answer, but I promise to listen with you. In this ever-changing world, perhaps the most precious thing is to walk together honestly, straight and unhurriedly. Goodbye and see you in the next book.